This is your lecture on perceptual interpretation. We talked about perceptual organization, which ran you through the monocular depth cues, Gestalt grouping principles, binocular depth cues, essentially kind of what sets up how we understand the world. Now, this is going to look at how all of that seems to play out. When we're looking at perception, we understand that perception is a learned ability. However, if we talk about someone being deprived of the information that would feed their perceptions, their sensations, it really becomes a question of when the deprivation occurs and how that will impact the person. Sensory deprivation in infancy, when the brain is forming, is very detrimental. In other words, the areas of the brain that would learn the ability, vision or smell or whatever it might be, if they're restricted from any of the information that would feed those cells and help them kind of link up and make the connections that would feed their expectations, if that doesn't happen, the brain doesn't develop. If the brain doesn't develop that ability, the ability no longer exists. So if you were to have an infant that was raised in complete darkness, their occipital lobe and the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe would not develop the ability to perceive sight. Now, this would have to be for quite some duration. It couldn't be just a short kind of deprivation, but again, that deprivation would be profound. When we look at sensory deprivation in adulthood, we've had stories of minors being trapped underground for 30 days or longer, people being stuck in places where they'd be in the dark for weeks at a time. And while the deprivation will impact them, they will have an experience, their vision, since it's already established, will come back and their perceptual abilities will also come back. What this tells us is that there's a critical period for all sensory and essentially perceptual development. To further illustrate the cost of deprivation, we can look at an experiment that was run by Blakemore and Cooper in 1970. They raised kittens from, early kittenhood to full adult cathood, really within about a year. And since cats do develop quicker than humans, it was a much easier experiment to run. Also completely unethical to do this to a human child. So they raised the kittens in an environment where they had no exposure to horizontal lines. They had experience with all other orientations of lines, but without the horizontal. What ended up happening when the full-grown cats were removed from this environment was they couldn't perceive any of the horizontal lines in their environment. In other words, those feature detector cells, the cells that would give you that firing for horizontal lines, never developed in their brain. If those cells aren't there, there was nothing to tell the cat what a horizontal line would have been. So I can't tell you what the cat would have seen, but if they had approached something like a set of stairs, those horizontal lines that you perceive as each rung of the stair, the cat would have seen maybe gradations in color and shading, but they wouldn't have seen that contour, that distinct line. It just would have been absent. So it would have most likely looked like a wall with kind of differing shades going up it. If the cat, however, were to turn its head sideways, those horizontal lines would have then become vertical and he would have been or she would have been able to perceive them. So every horizontal line that you can perceive as you're looking around the room that you're sitting in, the cat would have never been able to see. And it's because not that there was anything wrong with their eyes would have been functioning fine. The feature detector cells for horizontal lines in the brain that would have detected that message just didn't exist. We can also look at what happens when we restrict sensory information in our environment. And there's actually a therapy that comes from this that's called REST, Restricted Environmental Stimulation Therapy. What this does is it puts people into a situation where they are not being impacted by all the information that is flooding your sensory systems. It will be light restricted, sound restricted, the temperature will be at a kind of very comfortable body temperature. What this does is it allows the brain to not concentrate so much on the sensory information, and it helps people get into more of like a meditative state where they can start looking at things that cause them daily problems or anxiety, like smoking, drinking, and actually anxiety. All of those things have some application with this. This is what a sensory isolation chamber looks like. Now, if you are like me and you have no desire to ever get into something where it looks like a floating death coffin, that's cool. I would completely respect that. However, this one, what you have is the water is going to be body temperature It's going to have so much Epsom salt that essentially you won't have to maintain your floating. It's going to keep you buoyant. It will eliminate sound, and it will also eliminate any kind of sight or any vision. And so it should allow you to just relax, to think about your breathing, to think about relaxing the muscles in your body, all the other things that you just don't get to think about because you're usually trying to deal with other sensory information. We have a preferred way of seeing the world. We'll often call these things perceptual sets. It's a predisposition to see things, and one of our best perceptual sets is for faces. We also have perceptual adaptations, just like we had sensory adaptations. Now, if you remember back when we talked about sensory adaptation, it's when you have a constant, unchanging sensory experience, and eventually you adapt to it, so you stop paying attention to it. It's always there. So the band-aid that you're wearing on your finger is constantly putting pressure on your finger, and you start to ignore it. Well, with perceptual adaptations, it's the same thing. We don't wake up every morning trying to right ourselves or trying to figure out the orientation of a room. We know that everything should be right side up. George Stratton in 1896 decided to play with this, and he made a very clever set of goggles using mirrors, which inverted his vision. It put the floor on the ceiling and the ceiling on the floor. It took him roughly 8 days to fully adapt to the new environment, and once he did that, he had no problem navigating it. Now, the important thing to note is that humans adapt very well. I mean, 8 days takes some time. Other lower animals don't do this. So if you were to put, perceptual adaptation goggles or visual distortion goggles like I have in class on your cat or your dog, they will continue to have issues with it. However, if you were to wear them nonstop, you would eventually adapt to your newer displaced visual field. So we said that there's a preferred way that we like to see things, our perceptual sets. They're actually guided by something called schemas, and schemas are your mental frameworks. When we get into developmental psychology, we'll really talk about what schemas are, but essentially they're how you organize information in your mind. Now, we have a perceptual set or a preference for faces. Now, the interesting thing is if you go top down and you see the saxophonist, you still see the woman's face. You can make out both. And as you go further down, because you've previously seen the saxophonist, you still see him and the woman's face. And you get down to the woman's face and you still can see the saxophonist because you have previously experienced him. However, if you were to go bottom to top, that very first picture, you wouldn't notice the saxophonist. You would still see the woman's face, but because you had no previous experience with the saxophonist, you wouldn't see him. And as you move up, you'd very clearly then become aware of the saxophonist in the woman's face. Now, the interesting thing is that in all of them, you still see the woman's face. Whether it's meant to be a cloud and a bird, or it's actually the two eyes and the mouth, you still make it out because we have this perception or this setup to want to see faces. If you've ever seen these pictures where they have the flipped faces of the celebrities, you should know that on the very next slide, this is going to look very distorted. But this doesn't look like a distorted photo just yet. And that's simply because the lips and the eyes look normal to us. We're not used to seeing faces upside down, so the fact that the eyes and the mouth currently are in their correct orientation for somebody who would be right side up doesn't really kind of hit us. We just notice that the face is upside down. It's when you flip it that the change happens. Here we have the flipped version. Now, because the face is righted, it looks so much different, and we're just not used to this. Our previous or prior kind of experience with faces doesn't set us up to see that as normal. But if we looked at the flipped upside down face where the lips and the eyes are on an upside down face but in the correct orientation, that doesn't strike us as weird. One we have a lot of experience with, and that's going to be right side up faces and what they should look like. And the other we have very little experience with. We don't see the world with people upside down. So again, those perceptual sets, those schemas set us up for how we understand images in our world. Again, perceptual sets are guided by schemas, and schemas are going to be the frameworks that we use to form our understanding of our experiences. So really shorthand way of saying that, concepts we form from experience. our schemas for faces, where eyes and mouth should be, and even just kind of the shadows that should happen from them, prime us or set us up to see things like the man in the moon, a face in the clouds, a face in an electrical socket. It sets us up for this kind of perceptual understanding of what faces look like, and we can then apply it other places. The following will be just a couple of slides that help us play with our perceptual sets. Now, if you're looking at this picture, immediately you can see the human face, and then it may take you a little bit longer, but as soon as you tilt your head sideways, you should be able to read the word liar. But again, you have no problem making out the face first. For this one, you should see two of the mariachi players, but you should also see the old woman and the old man's face. And you can flip easily between the two simply just because you have this preference for faces. With something like the Devil's Fork, or in this case, a variant on the Devil's Fork, which is the elephant, when we're looking at this, if you look at the feet should travel up to the body, and if you look at the body should travel down to the feet, but you very quickly realize the feet are not connected to the body. At quick glance, it looks like a normal elephant. It's when you get further into the picture and you start to try to match the feet to the legs that the illusion becomes very, very kind of almost uncomfortable and troubling. And again, we have this perceptual set that feet and legs go together because very rarely do we see disembodied feet. But again, this causes us to, at first glance, ignore the problem with the elephant's legs and see it as a fine elephant until you start to track the feet up. This traditionally is another variant on what is known as the Devil's Fork. And the Devil's Fork is a pitchfork where the tines of the fork don't actually meet the body. And here you're just seeing it with columns. If you look at the bottom, 3 very solid columns that should go to the top. But if you look at the top, there's 2 very squared off columns. And it becomes very confusing and legitimately uncomfortable to the brain. The brain starts to feel discomfort towards this because it's violating how things normally operate. It's violating your perceptual set. If you have a chance, this is worth looking at. We're going to talk about something called inattentional blindness. If you have a chance, Google inattentional blindness and brain games, or you can look at inattentional blindness and the gorilla experiment, but I'll explain what those are to you here in a second. The original inattentional blindness experiment had people wearing white t-shirts and black t-shirts, and they were passing a basketball. And the viewer was instructed to count the number of times the people who were wearing the white t-shirts caught the basketball. And so they would pass it around very quickly. And as you were paying attention to the ball, some of the players would leave and a gorilla came into the frame, caught the ball, passed the ball, and then walked out of the frame and was replaced again by another player. 73% of the people missed that a person in a full gorilla suit had entered into the picture. And when asked why, they couldn't really explain it, but it's a really simple thing. We have something called inattentional blindness. It's part of our selective attention. We can only attend to so much. And if you have something that is very attention demanding, you may then filter out or not pay attention to other things that you would normally think would be obvious in your environment. So as you are driving and you're focusing on the road ahead of you, you have certain expectations, like there should be cars that you need to worry about. While you're in your car, another car could cause a significant amount of damage. While you're in your car, a truck or a semi could cause significant damage. But often, motorists don't really think about motorcyclists as a significant threat to them. And as you're driving, you will scan and look in your environment for those big threats. And it's when you are going to turn that you may check your mirror, literally have a motorcyclist in your side mirror, not even notice them because they don't hit on that perception of they're not a threat to my car. And that's how a lot of motorcyclists get hit. It's not that the person didn't check their blind spots or check their mirrors. It's that they literally weren't looking for them. They weren't attentive to them, and therefore they didn't see them. When you are focusing a heavy amount of attention on a single task, you limit the amount that you're able to scan and be aware of everything going around you. All of us are used to Easter eggs today in different movies, the things that are kind of hidden in there by animators or other people involved. But Disney has been kind of notorious for having a couple of inappropriate things. And again, the reason that it takes so long for us to catch them is very much due to inattentional blindness. As you're following the story or the characters, you don't notice the little things that are happening in the background because that's usually not what you're paying attention to. So, The Lion King, apparently that when Simba flopped down in the, I don't know, grass filled with flowers, the word sex was supposedly floating out. In The Rescuers, there was a naked woman in the window above them while they're flying on the back of, I want to say it was an albatross. And again, nobody noticed this. I watched this as a kid and it never registered. And again, it's simply because it's to the background. It's you're blind. You're not paying attention to it. You're paying attention to the dialogue between the two mice and the fear that one of them is experiencing. You don't really scan the background. If you have the DVD version of the cover for The Little Mermaid, this gem was put in by an animator who was later fired, but that would be a phallus that they used as one of the spires on the castle. And again, since you're going to be paying attention to the major characters, that doesn't really seem to kind of register. And this one, Disney said that the bishop was kneeling down, but unfortunately, he got neither shorter nor did his feet shift or move when this happened. And again, nobody's paying attention to it because this is the big dramatic scene and your attention is diverted elsewhere. This section here, I would fly through. Chances are you'll never see it on the AP exam, and since it has not been scientifically verified as even being remotely real, it really doesn't belong in this section very well at all. But some people believe in extrasensory perception, and I guess to each their own. I just tend to agree more with things that have been scientifically proven. So, controversial. No one's truly been able to scientifically prove that any of these things exist. If we're looking at telepathy, it's your ability to read minds. Clairvoyance, your ability to see beyond physical barriers, and precognition, your ability to tell the truth. And then there's also parapsychology, and there's ESP, which again is kind of really all of these together. And then psychokinesis, your ability to move objects with your mind. If you are interested in why most of this just doesn't make sense, here's an interesting TED Talk on consciousness, which really does kind of delve into some of these aspects. On this page, you simply just get the definitions again. Now, I'm telling you, you will probably never see a single one of these on the AP exam, and I don't really put much stock into them as far as questions that should be on your tests. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have one, but I would not spend the majority of your time trying to memorize what these are. I've never, ever seen a question about this on an AP exam. It's just that most people think that these things seem to be part of psychology, and they're really not. Of all of the lovely things that is on this page, the Zener cards are really the only thing that you might need to identify. And these are a deck of cards that have symbols, and people use this to test things like different types of ESP. Run a luck, the fact that some people just happen to get these right by chance, and really the big thing is the conclusion. ESP has not been scientifically demonstrated. People who have these abilities or claim to have these abilities can't necessarily produce them when asked to. Here are your Zener cards, and this is the end of this lecture.